We've got a great panel tonight. We are led with Anne Applebaum, who you all know is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author for the Gulag of History, as well as the head of the Transitions Forum at the Legatum Institute, as well as a columnist for the Washington Post. Then we have from your right to the left, we have Peter Pomerantsev, who is a regular writer on Russia, featured in the London Review of Books, Financial Times, and elsewhere. And he is the author of a forthcoming book on Putin's Russia. There is no truth and everything is possible. And the next to him is Michael Weiss, who's the editor-in-chief of The Interpreter, which is the publication to go to if you want to understand what's happening in Russia or in Ukraine for that matter. And then to Anne's right, your left, is Jeff Pyatt, the U.S. Ambassador in Ukraine, a distinguished American diplomat who before that served as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for South and Central Asian Affairs. And then next to Jeff is Alexander Sherba, who's the Ambassador at Large in the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry and a former foreign policy advisor to Prime Minister Yatsenyuk. And with that, I'll get out of the way. Have a nice evening.
Great, thank you, John. As I said, we've had an all-day conversation, and we'll try and produce some of the pearls of the conversation now. I'm told that the hashtag for this event, if you want to tweet, is hashtag Russia versus reality. I think we've got little cards that say that, and we're of course at Legatum Institute, at Atlantic Council Eurasia, at USA and UK. So there we are. We have all the recommendations. I'm going to begin by asking Peter and Michael, who are the authors of this really spectacular and fine new paper, which will be published next week, to give you some of the elements of that paper and some of the elements of their diagnosis, and then we'll have a view from Ukraine. How does this work in reality? How does it work in the ground from our Ukrainian and American colleagues' point of view? Peter, why don't you begin by explaining what the thesis is?
Yeah, I might actually begin with a little pearl of wisdom that was given to me during my research by a Russian media guru by the name of Vasily Gartov, who now lives in the US. And he put this very beautifully, and he sort of summarized the challenge. And he said, in the 20th century, the great challenge was the battle for freedom of information, the battle against censorship. In the 21st century, the battle is going to be with the abuse of freedom of information by various malign states and non-state actors. And it's funny, I've been doing this paper for 2 months, and the vague theme was info war, and I was like, info war, that's when one side says one thing and another side says another thing, and they kind of argue against each other, like in Parliament or during a debate. And very soon, when I started sort of reading up the Russian military theories behind their current information strategy, I realized that my journalistic and sort of liberal conception of debate and polyphony and information, they were fairly useless. Because essentially what we've seen, especially since 2008, is a body of thinking within the Russian military establishment and increasingly the political establishment, and now pretty much everywhere in society, that sees information as a weapon. It's the weaponization of information. So they don't necessarily write about information as messaging or as propaganda or as public diplomacy, as persuasion. They write about it as a tool to confuse, to demoralize, to divide and conquer. They talk about active measures again, which is an old Soviet term. So to give some brief examples so that we're all on the same page. Confusion. After the MH17 tragedy, Russia Today, the external arm of the Russian media sort of front, as well as Russian media inside of Russia, spit out dozens, maybe a dozen, versions of why the plane could have gone down. So they're fairly absurd ones, like maybe the Ukrainians were trying to shoot down Putin's private plane, which looks a little bit similar. Or maybe the plane was full of dead bodies. And it wasn't about proving anything. It was just about sort of splaying the information space with so many bizarre theories that the search for truth got muddled. So it's a confusion as a tactic. Demoralization. We see this a lot, for example, in the way Russia talks to the Baltic states. They're constantly insinuating you've got huge problems with Nazis. They're using the same language they used in Ukraine. People near the Russian state, not necessarily from the Russian states, will go on public saying, we should, push forward over the border there. And you talk to people in Estonia, and they're like, we don't know what they're doing, why they're doing it, but the effect is to rattle everyone here, Western journalists write about this, our investment climate goes down. So it's not clear whether they're making sort of any direct threat, but they're demoralizing and warping the information space around the Baltics and around Estonia. Another sort of typical approach is something that is referred to as divide and conquer. So if in the good old days, the Soviet good old days, the Soviet propaganda machine would basically spread one message, which was a leftist, pro-communist message among its sort of affiliates in the West, whether through sort of the Morning Star or through communist parties in Germany. Now, the Kremlin doesn't really care. It has a very liquid approach to ideology. It can back the left in Europe, it can back the right in Europe. The point is to create as much fuss, as much confusion, and as much controversy and conflict in these countries as possible. So it's a divide and conquer tactic rather than a persuasion tactic. And let's sort of define what we mean by active measures. Active measures were a strategy developed by the Soviet Union to, I think one of the definitions is pollute the opinion-making process in the West. One active measure, for example, was something called Disinformation, which was planting various sort of false stories in Western media, which would discredit the West, make Europe row with America, and so forth. So a famous one, for example, was in 1970s or was it 1980, a story spread by the KGB that the CIA was responsible for the AIDS virus. And it's very weird. Suddenly, you see Russian media working, transmitting towards the West, echoing these tactics. So there was a story on Spanish RT, Russia Today, about the US being responsible for the Ebola virus. We haven't seen this stuff for a long time, but it's coming back, and it's coming back with a vengeance. So this leaves us in a kind of complicated place, because the minute we say that there is an info war on, we're almost getting sucked into the Kremlin's paradigm, because the way the Kremlin excuses this behavior or explains this behavior says, hey, we're being attacked. The CIA controls CNN. We've got to do the same thing back. That's always the rationale. A lot of the time they don't deny what they're doing. They're just saying, this is the world we live in. So the minute we say there's an info war on, we're kind of, we're getting sucked into this idea that, the Russians are doing it, the Americans are doing it, so it's kind of fine for everyone to lie. I maybe put it a different way. What this actually is, and this was another phrase told to me by a journalist at Radio Free Europe, Robert Colson. He called it not an info war, but a war on information. It's a war on the idea of truth, a war on the possibility of truth. Because as the Kremlin, practices all these disinformation techniques, the end effect is to just basically destroy our faith in any sort of media and to destroy the possibility of debate. This is why conspiracy is such a favorite technique both inside of Russian media and also in sort of Kremlin media as it talks to the West. The more conspiracies it pushes out there, the more it becomes impossible to have a debate, the more it becomes, the field for establishing truth becomes hampered. And why is the Kremlin doing this? Because it's doing this as part of a broader vision that it has. Basically, the Kremlin feels itself weak. And so, at least since 2004, it's been developing something it calls asymmetric war. It knows it can't take the West on in sort of direct military confrontation. So, Putin talks about this a little bit. We have to be cleverer than the other side. We have to climb inside their vulnerabilities and exploit them and turn them against the West. It's a very Secret Service approach, but it's now become policy. And this sort of asymmetric war, it's about abusing the freedom of information for disinformation. It's about abusing the idea of open markets to use money and trade as a weapon. It's about using the idea of freedom of culture to exploit culture to sow discontent. For example, using Russian compatriots organizations abroad to subvert the Baltics. So it's part of a whole symphony of methods. It's part of the Kremlin's new idea of non-linear or hybrid war, which is basically the idea of using, the weaponization of information, money, and culture, plus covert military action, as we see in the offensive in Ukraine. So it's part of a grander strategy. This is not just about some dodgy news on a Russian channel. This is part of a whole vision of how you can conduct warfare in the 21st century. And my worry is the Kremlin is doing this now. My worry is other rising aggressive authoritarian states are going to be using these tools. Non-state actors are going to be using these tools, and we basically stand in front of a 21st century where all these methods become become common, and we have neither the analytical nor the institutional capacity to really start to get a handle on it. So that's my dystopian vision. We stand before a deluge of disinformation and subversion, but Michael is going to say how we can solve it.
Well,
Right, Michael Weiss. Right.
no, I think Peter's point is apt. Active measures have now become sort of government media policy, right? Organs like RT, which formerly known as Russia Today, the Kremlin's most successful English language propaganda channel. What they're doing every day is essentially a form of active measures, planting these stories, throwing disinformation into the ether in the hopes that their core constituency, who can range from, Occupy Wall Street types, anti-globalization types, anti-imperialist types, to indeed the far-right conspiracy theorist fringes of Europe and the United States, will gobble them up whole and believe every word of it.
Or the
But
financial,
also,
or financial elites as
all the
well.
financial
It's
elites.
a much broader thing.
Yeah. Or, and I think more worrisome, that these stories will actually be picked up by respectable mainstream media organizations. And here's the problem. I mean, I'm a journalist by trade, and I've seen this. I started studying the Syria conflict very closely, and I saw it being done there by the Russian government, and I now see it in Ukraine. The problem is the Putin regime understands that Western institutions, which have this ethical sort of standard of transparency, objectivity, giving, quote, both sides of the story, that is a vulnerability to be exploited. So when the Russian Foreign Ministry comes out with an account for an event, either tragic or geopolitically exigent, it doesn't matter how farcical or absurd the account may be, you're going to see the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the BBC run a headline that says, Russian government, : and then give that event. And eventually, even if you read through the text of the article and you see that it's mostly kind of nonsense, the headline does begin to penetrate, and this has a psychological effect. And after time, you reach a kind of saturation point where you start to doubt, the truth, and you begin buying this propaganda. And as a journalist, and this is something just very easily self-corrected by media organizations, which have the capacity, even if they're not expert in KGB warfare or disinformation, just common sense. Give you one example. Right after the chemical weapons attack in Damascus in 2013, one of the Russian Foreign Ministry's many manifold accounts of what really took place was to say the whole thing was staged, and their supposed gotcha moment was cited by Alexander Lukashevich, the Foreign Ministry spokesperson, who said, aha, the first video from showing the victims of this attack in Damascus was posted on YouTube before the alleged attack. Now, of course, the difference there being that YouTube runs on California time, not Damascus time. So the fact that the Russian Foreign Ministry doesn't know that the Earth goes around the sun in a daily fashion is itself newsworthy. But when media organizations are taking this and saying, well, suddenly there's this sort of chaff that's thrown into the news cycle, and we have to treat it because it's newsworthy in a different respect, then you begin to have a problem. One of the things I've noticed, and here I'm going to be perhaps as cynical as some of the political technologists in Russia, human rights, democracy, these are all important subjects, and the media is honor-bound and duty-bound to report it. But really what gets people going is money, right? When you strip bare the layers of Putinism, when you get rid of the liquid ideology. Our own State Department cables referred to Russia, citing a Spanish counterterrorism magistrate, as a virtual mafia state. Well, what do mafias run on? They run on extortion rackets, they run on bribes, they run on corruption. And I find that every time I write a story about some Kremlin official or even a low-level flunky who's ferreted away millions of dollars in an offshore bank account, using dummy corporations that are registered in London or the British Virgin Islands or the Bahamas, everyone wants to pay attention to it, including the Russian media, even if it is state-owned. And we've seen this actually in recent history inside Russia. In 2011, putatively, the protest movement in Moscow, the largest protest movement you've seen in Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union, was about a fraudulent Duma election. But the rallying cry of that protest movement was the party of crooks and thieves. You can dupe the Russian people, you can steal from them only up to a certain point, and then, the Narod rebels and people get fed up with it. And indeed, when you have a country that a third of its GDP, according to an independent monitor, is frittered away by bribery, you have a big problem. The money is being stolen from the Russian people. So, using very limited resources, and I know that media is now changing, but it doesn't have to be the dead letter press. I'm not talking about sort of the big broadsheet publications like the New York Times or the Guardian. I mean, BuzzFeed, online media organs, can invest a little bit of money sending journalists to some of these offshore jurisdictions, to do some shoe leather reporting, knocking on doors, sitting in cafes, talking to the employees. It could be an admin or it could be the director of these registrar companies who know that entity LLC X really belongs to such and such oligarch, and he is protecting that money for someone very high up in the Kremlin. This happens all the time. It's an open secret. So what I would call the offshoreization of journalism should be a strategic priority. It makes sense if you're a journalist to do this because it's a fascinating story, right? Putin is rumored to be the wealthiest man in Europe. Where's all the money? The other thing I would say is if you're looking to fundamentally change the debate we're having about Russia, and the problem about this debate is we don't have any common premise. We don't have any starting point. Is Russia a partner? Is it an adversary? Oh, well, we oppose them a little bit. We want sanctions here or there, but maybe not too much, and we can't wait to get rid of the sanctions. The problem is really in the West, too, because the money comes here, right? We have to get our own house in order. So if you do this anti-corruption investigation, I promise you, I guarantee you, invariably it will come back to some European company that's building, a dacha for the first deputy prime minister of Russia, a story I broke in Foreign Policy magazine yesterday. It will come back to, again, these sort of Caribbean island jurisdictions that do have ties to countries like Great Britain and that can have pressure exerted on them to increase their statutes on transparency. Actually, I think the government, and again, this is where we go from bottom up to top down, I would say, government policy, including sanctions regimes, can actually help these investigations. The most interesting disclosure in the first regime the U.S. passed on Russia for the invasion of Crimea was not, to my mind, it wasn't about actually institutionally changing the economy of Russia. It was a form of sexy information that was being released by the U.S. Treasury Department, namely that Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, has assets in a Swiss commodities trader called Gunvor and may, quote, have direct access to funds. Okay, to me, as a journalist, this is a godsend because not only I already knew about that story, but not only does that impel other journalists to go out and report it or to dig up dirt on this stuff, it gives them a kind of blanket for libel litigation, right? Another point I want to add about sort of concrete measures is investing in a libel defense fund for journalists to incentivize them and their editors. I lived in London for 2 years, and the libel laws here are Byzantine and notorious and horrible. And I can't tell you how many stories I was inclined to write about, but only to be told by whatever editor, you can't do it because so-and-so is libel happy. And they don't even have to take you to court. They can just send a nasty letter from a white shoe law firm, and that just completely shutters the entire debate. So giving journalists the power to do this kind of in-depth investigative reporting, I think, is crucial. Another thing I would say, and again, unfortunately, this comes back to the issue of money. The Kremlin has purchased quite a lot of influence and quite a lot of so-called expertise in Western think tanks, even some governmental, non-governmental organizations that are funded by Russian state cultural agencies, and I would even say probably in institutions that we have yet to uncover. But when people have money invested in Russia, and this is widely known, or at least there's an open question as to the fact, and they manage to get an op-ed in, say, the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal, arguing for a policy that somewhere between total capitulation to Finlandization, right? Both within the spectrum of what the Russian Foreign Ministry would like to see the U.S. and the West do with respect to Ukraine. You have a problem. Just to give you one example, there's a scholar in a prominent think tank based in Moscow who's a former member of Russian military intelligence. He writes in the FT. He doesn't disclose that fact. Yeah, I guarantee you if Leon Panetta wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post, and in the skirt identifying him, it said, this man has a prominent walnut farm in California, and didn't mention the fact he was the defense secretary and the CIA director of the United States, that newspaper would be laughed out of town. So what I would call editorial transparency. And by the way, we've already seen that this is successful. Just to give you another concrete example, recently the New York Times published an op-ed by a woman who was shown to have been a consultant to the state oil company of Azerbaijan. She was writing about Azerbaijan energy policy, actually and ironically taking a very anti-Russian position, but had not disclosed the affiliation. And it was actually Bob Coulson at RFE, whom Peter had mentioned in another context, who did the real pressure, putting the pressure on the New York Times, which was then embarrassed and had to publish this clarification. The clarification ended up eclipsing the actual argument itself. So you can force these sort of major institutions to sort of correct themselves or to acknowledge that they might have been duped or had. Remember, active measures only work insofar as people are willing to be fooled or hoodwinked or taken in by them. finally, I would say, look, there are stories that somehow are not being told because they're not deemed newsworthy or nobody even knows that they're taking place. One of the biggest stories I think that's being missed right now, particularly in Europe, is the proliferation of Russian espionage. I mean at all levels. I mean at the sort of the naked governmental level, trying to infiltrate ministries and government offices, particularly in the European Union itself, and the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe is a big one, but also industrial espionage and the like. The problem is not much is being done about it. And where counterintelligence used to be the work of secret services or state security services, it can now actually be the work of journalists. You just have to follow the leads and follow the traces. And again, because it is not that difficult to find out where money is being hidden or what belongs to whom, and it's especially with the databases that are now available online. I mean, downloading documents from the Luxembourg Stock Exchange, for instance, can disclose quite a lot of interesting data. These things are possible. So it's actually refocusing the story on elements and aspects that Russia has, by its own efforts to distract and to throw so much sand in the air, very greatly gained by having them sort of hushed up. I think that's more or less kind of the starting point for things that both civil society and government can do to kind of push back against all this.
So there should be more investigative journalism.
Absolutely.
There should be more investigative journalism in offshore places.
For sure.
We should start thinking about helping journalists who do this kind of work defend themselves against libel.
Yep.
And that might include government officials occasionally releasing information that would be helpful.
Yep.
There should be, one idea that came up this afternoon is it would also help if there were more connections between journalists doing this kind of work in different countries.
Yeah.
So there's lots of German investigative journalists who could benefit from work being done elsewhere. Peter also, I think, earlier in the day had thoughts about other kinds of institutions aside from what journalists can do.
Yeah, looking at sort of the broader picture a little bit. So we have this word, and I heard this as I was researching this InfoWar theme for a couple of months. Everything is propaganda. Propaganda is everywhere. Everyone does propaganda. Me sitting here convincing you that's propaganda. Chatting up a girl is propaganda. Russia does a bit of propaganda as well. It's become a completely useless term. What I'd firstly like to have is a new kind of glossary defining forms of communication and abuse of communication, going from misinformation, which is not to be confused with disinformation, all the way through to public diplomacy and persuasion, which are utterly legitimate forms of government public relations. Once we've got that established, we can talk in a much more concrete way about what different media institutions are doing. Instead of saying everyone's doing propaganda, we can say they're doing disinformation, misinformation, they're using linguistic formula like false assurances, which are way beyond the pale. In my dreams, I would like, and probably would be in my dreams, would like to see sort of Al Jazeera, BBC, all the big media institutions sit down and say, we all hate each other, we all believe in debate, but there are things that we do not do because it is not journalism anymore when you do X, Y, Z. And the people who do that, I shan't name them, but clearly you know who I'm alluding to, they can do what they want. They're not part of our gang. They're not part of our charter. They don't get the little stamp of media, our own self-regulated stamp of media organization. And then to regulate that, or to not legally regulate, just to sort of apply peer pressure, I'd like to see a Transparency International for disinformation, a rating system, which would slap on different media organizations, including Fox, including, I don't know, whatever Erdogan will have tomorrow, including Russia Today, and give them a rating from 1 out of 10. So that we have a tool to say, they say they're a media organization, they get sort of 1 out of 10 on the disinformation rating. I'm not sure we should even trust these people.
And, so it's the age-old problems of media. If it makes good telly, therefore it's newsworthy or it's interesting. No, it's not. When the BBC invites a conspiracy theorist who says MH17 was shot out of the sky by Ukrainian fighter jets, when there's no evidence to substantiate that, and then invites him on purposefully just to sort of mock him or lampoon him. I mean, that's 15 minutes of my viewing time that could have been spent by somebody explaining sort of why the Russians might have done this or giving accounts of evidence for how we know that it was the Russian separatists backed by Russian military intelligence. I mean, putting public pressure on these institutions, particularly ones that are funded by taxpayers, such as the BBC, that also can be very powerful. You can write into the Press Complaints Commission.
The
Great, thank you. I would like to, you can have one last
One last
sentence.
thing. Also, we have to think the difference. One very important thing. We have to think about the audience as well, because in the current means of production of contemporary media, we can basically just spit out lie after lie after lie. You're not going to ever be able to stop all the disinformation. We have to think about public information campaigns, both among sort of Russians in Estonia where it's urgent, but also in the West where we seem to have a bit of a challenge with critical thinking at the moment. So to re-educate the public so they understand how they're being spun. We all need anti-spin doctor lessons from school. I mean, I often compare it to sort of venereal disease. We've got people to wear condoms. We need to get people to wear information condoms. There are information viruses out there. Start taking care and start looking after yourselves. Because that's at the end of the day, we have to change behavior.
We're now going to shift the conversation a little bit and focus much more specifically on the experience of Ukraine over the last year, which is a country that suddenly found itself at the center of an international argument, not merely about people's opinions about what was going on in Ukraine, but the actual facts were disputed. What actually happened on the Maidan? What was the course of events? And Alexander Sherber was one of the people who was in the middle of some of those arguments, and maybe you'd like to talk a little bit about it. So.
Yes, thank you. I am a public servant and not a journalist by trade, so I will be more cautious in the words I am choosing, and focus really on the facts and on the experiences Ukraine underwent over the last couple of years, and especially over the last couple of months. I was walking around here in this wonderful city, which everybody loves. If you find a place on earth that everybody loves, it will be probably London. And it's very difficult to imagine that on the other side of the same continent, the unthinkable things are happening. There is war, there is immeasurable suffering. The country is bleeding. Ukraine is bleeding. We had this so-called hybrid war that was waged on Ukraine over the last half a year or a bit since February. Now we have what we call a hybrid ceasefire. And again, we are trying to fight back, and we are fighting back, and we are probably the nation that is less fearful of some of our neighbors than other European nations are right now. I got confused in my own words. I'm sorry. So we are fighting this war, and we are not only we are right now in this situation where we are also trying to find out how we came to this kind of situation, what caused this kind of situation, and how we overcome this incredible mess we find ourselves in, this incredible tragedy. And the answer to both these questions has to do with propaganda. Or, I don't know, we have been discussing whether we use this word to, to freely, maybe it's not a propaganda, maybe it's an alternative world picture, I don't know, and a very aggressive one for that matter. And the tragedy Ukraine is facing right now is having to do with the way Russia sees itself and sees the outside world and is trying to impose this world picture on other nations. It all started with the annexation of Crimea in February, or seemingly started in February, when people dressed in green all of a sudden popped up in Crimea and chased away the legitimate government, and everybody was stunned and surprised by that move. Some of them were anonymous, some of them were not that anonymous, and then these men dressed in green traveled to Ukraine's east and started another mess that turned out much bloodier, and this is something that we are dealing with right now. One of these men, his name was Borodai, decided to be the prime minister of his republic. The other one, his name is Girkin by passport. He calls himself Strelkov, decided to be the Minister of Defense. I can literally imagine this conversation. Well, you will be the Prime Minister and I will be just the Minister. Maybe they, I don't know, bet on it. I don't know how they decided. But obviously the foreign component in this whole situation is very clear, no matter how Russia tries to deny it. But when you really think about how it started, of course it not started in February. It started maybe a decade, maybe a little longer ago, when disillusioned with the failed transition period, or whatever you call it, of Yeltsin presidency, Russia came to the idea that it is encircled by the hostile outside world, and this hostile outside world is trying to really enslave or destroy Russia, whatever. So this dark picture of the outside world and of the things that how the world really is was born. And unfortunately, the majority of the Russian population bought it. Then over a couple of years passed, and this decisive moment for Ukraine came when Russia, for some reason, thought that Ukraine would be turning towards east and joining the customs union, but as events showed, the Ukrainian population, the people of Ukraine, wanted a different thing. So this whole revolution started in 2013, in part also inspired by the Russian propaganda, which was, for instance, trying to picture and to make Ukraine fearful of Europe, where everybody is obligatory gay or gay-friendly, or where, for instance, England was pictured as a country where there are no mothers or fathers anymore. There is parent one and parent two. And people were really seriously, because just based on one questionnaire that was circulated somewhere in Great Britain, they made these conclusions, gigantic in their scale and their stupidity, and they were trying to impose it on Ukrainian population. Ukrainians didn't buy it. Ukrainians took to the streets, and under the banners of United Europe, really fought for the European choice. And then, in the end of this standoff on the Maidan, the revolution, when Putin, well, not Putin, what I'm saying, when someone realized that he was losing Ukraine completely, so someone decided to go and get Crimea. So the propaganda was an integral part of this operation that was going on Ukrainian ground over the last couple of months. And in very practical terms, I will just give you examples of these misconceptions, ideological misconceptions that Russian propaganda feeds upon. First of all, the misconception or the notion of Ukraine as a failed state. Of course, Ukraine chose freedom, democracy, and therefore it failed. Ukraine chose freedom and democracy because it was almost a failed state. So whatever, there are different, kinds of explanations for the events, but in the end, you are with this idea of Ukraine being in the hands of some secret puppeteers that are, ruling the world from behind the scenes, and Ukraine is a traitor who betrayed the Slavic unity and must be punished for it. So this would be one of the premises the Russian propaganda works upon. The other would be calling whoever disagrees with you a fascist. This is amazing how widely and how freely this term is getting used by the propaganda. You can be anti-Semitic, homophobic, xenophobic, and generally a very nasty person, but in the same time you are an anti-fascist. And it's just like junta, you know. You can have your government basically filled with former KGB operatives, but you're not a junta. And you can have a government where there is not a single professional military person or a person with the Secret Service background, or maybe one who runs actually the Secret Service of Ukraine, and you are a junta. So it's not just playing with the words, it's playing messing with your mind. And unfortunately, they do succeed because they have no limits vis-a-vis the funds, they have no limits vis-a-vis the human resources, and they're not limited by the rules because they are so deeply convinced that this outside world is so dark, so sinister, it doesn't recognize any rules. So Russia fights back and recognizing no rules either. And the third very disturbing feature of this worldview that Russia is trying to impose on Ukraine is the idea that a nation can be great, and they are obsessed with this notion of, you know, bringing back the greatness of the Soviet Union. That this greatness can be based not on, you know, successful economy or I don't know the spread of Russian language or whatever, but on how much you are feared throughout the world. You ask many Russians. You ask them what was so great about the Soviet Union that you miss so much. And the answer would be, in 90%, well, we were so feared throughout the world. And this is a very disturbing thing, you know, striving to a greatness based on being feared. Why I'm telling you this? First of all, because this is the incredibly painful experience that Ukraine underwent in this year. And we know that it's not about words, it's not about ideas, you know. In the famous Chris Nolan movie Perception, there was this phrase that I like a lot. There is no virus and there is no parasite more persistent than an idea. And this is exactly the case. This is the case where the words and the ideas actually turn out into a virus that really brings tragedy and destroys lives. We had this experience in our country, and I just wanted to congratulate the United Kingdom on having the Russia Today branch opened, or to about open within next 50 minutes, and just give it a thought about what kind of worldview, what kind of ideas, what kind of persistent virus this can bring with it. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Pyatt, who has been the American ambassador in Kiev for this rather turbulent period. You'll now speak also about your perception of this issue there.
Great, thanks. And I'll try to be very brief. Alexander covered a lot of the ground. I would just like to emphasize to everybody the importance of recognizing the central role that this battle for the information space has played as part of a larger Russian strategy to exercise influence over Ukraine, to derail the European choice of the Ukrainian people, and to sow confusion. We saw this even before the Maidan began, with the advertisements that Alexander alluded to, funded by Russia, springing up especially in eastern Ukraine, describing all the terrible things that would happen if Ukraine went ahead with the association agreement. Threats to traditional Ukrainian values, spiraling unemployment, rising prices, all meant to create an atmosphere of fear to enhance the pressure that Putin was bringing to bear on Yanukovych. The next phase, of course, came with the invasion of Crimea. I will always remember the cloud of confusion on the foggy day when the Russian flag was raised over the assembly in Crimea. And the answer from the Russians was, those aren't our green men. Look, they don't have any badges on them. And then we saw the strategy escalate further into Donbass. beginning with the arrival of these political tourists from Russia who were showing up in places like Kharkiv with a task simply to sow chaos, escalating to the deployment of Russian mercenaries, GRU and FSB agents, and eventually escalating to the insertion of some of Russia's most advanced weapon systems, very advanced ground-to-air missiles, and then at the end of August, literally thousands of regular Russian troops, an intervention that persists to this day. Throughout, the Russian effort in the Donbass has paid particular attention to sowing fear, stirring chaos. It's not a coincidence that one of the first things that these Russian proxies and Russian fighters have done when they've come into cities like Slavyansk is to seize control of the radio towers and the television stations and to switch over to only Russian content. And to this day, in the separatist-controlled regions, Ukrainian content is off the air. It reflects the importance that Moscow has attached to these issues. There's also an important international dimension of this campaign of misdirection. A good example, of course, is the reports which emerged first in Russian social media with manufactured YouTubes and eventually showed up on Russia Today of American mercenaries allegedly fighting in eastern Ukraine. This started on Russia Today, then moved into regular Russian diplomacy as the Russian Foreign Ministry began to make this claim, and I'm certain was demarching key European capitals, pointing out that Blackwater was supposedly on the ground in eastern Ukraine, and that we needed to this conflict needed to be understood not as one of Russian aggression, but as some kind of a conflict between East and West, which we do not believe it is. Our best weapon in dealing with this and answering this campaign of misdirection, of course, is the truth. In this regard, we'll have a very important example over the next couple of days. You have Ukraine's parliamentary elections last Sunday, which were a critically important example of a free and fair contest, judged such by the international community, which provided an unambiguous mandate for further reform and evolution of Ukraine towards European institutions. That contrasts rather dramatically with what's going to happen on Sunday in this pseudo-election that the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics are going to hold. There are statements today with some of the so-called candidates in these pseudo-elections acknowledging that everybody knows who is going to be anointed through this process. And I think we all need to be very wary of any attempt by Russia to suggest that somehow these elections will establish legitimate authorities, which Moscow would then use to disassociate from the conflict and to try to deny their role, Russia's role, as a co-belligerent in the conflict in eastern Ukraine. In this regard, it's important to note the unanimity that we have maintained. The United States, key European leaders, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon have all made clear their view that the so-called elections that the separatists are holding with Russian support on Sunday are illegal and will not be recognized. But I am quite certain, in the spirit of the presentation that we heard from Peter, that this is going to become part of the Russian narrative and will be used to shape the debate, which has not just the objective of legitimizing what Russia has been doing for the past 8 months, this relentless campaign of aggression that Russia has been engaged in, but also to achieve Russia's long-term objective, which is to redirect Ukraine's policies and to not deny the Ukrainian people the sovereign choice that they've made now through the presidential elections in May and last Sunday's parliamentary elections.
Can I ask you something? A few days ago at the Valdai conference this year, the Russian president spent, 45 minutes very clearly attacking the United States, attacking President Obama, American policy. He said very little about Europe or Europeans. I mean, as an American diplomat, do you sense that this attempt to separate sort of America from Europe and to somehow break up what used to be the Western alliance, do you sense that this has any effect? Does it affect your colleagues?
we certainly sense the effort. I don't think it's succeeding, because our strategic objectives as regards Ukraine are exactly the same as the European Union's. In fact, our objective, which tracks with that of the Ukrainian government today, is anchored in the success of Ukraine's European project and the association agreement. So yes, there have been some pretty egregious efforts by Russia to try to divide, and I think one of the great successes of Obama administration policy has been the unanimity that we've maintained with our European partners as regards both the unacceptability of Russia's actions, the essential requirement to restore the principle of respect for Ukraine's territorial integrity, and I would particularly single out Chancellor Merkel's very clear statements on this issue, and then finally, the importance of the sovereign choice that the Ukrainian people themselves get to make.
Thank you very much.